protocol to choose one of two candidates. And this is a secure cryptographic protocol. Yes.
Sorry, you didn't hear me so far, but Olga, okay, sorry, nothing. I have nothing to say. I thought there was no recording, so go on.
Okay. So these parties decide to do the election using a secure cryptographic protocol. But this is a somewhat weird cryptographic protocol. And let's suppose now that one of the parties decided to misbehave and he cheated during this computation. And somehow the other two parties figured it out. So this protocol, what it instructs them to do, is to completely throw away this corrupted party and simply exchange their inputs. So they reveal to each other which candidate they want to elect to presidency. And now each of them has all the information they need so they can decide who the winner is. But now one of them actually realizes something. He knows what the other party actually voted for. And we all know how these types of situations end up with. So clearly this is arguably undesirable. We don't want parties to actually reveal to each other, even if they are honest, we don't want them to reveal to each other which party they voted for. This is a problem. But this is actually allowed. I mentioned earlier that they're using a secure cryptographic protocol. And as it turns out, it actually is allowed. Security actually allows that to happen. And the main reason why this is fine is because when we define security, we only care about what the malicious party sees, what the adversary attacking the protocol sees during the execution. And we don't care about what the honest parties see. And this is what the definition says. And in fact, there are even protocols that utilizes this fact in order to improve the round complexity of the protocol. And there is an example by Shai Kushilevitz and Paskin Chernyavsky, where the party somehow figured out who the corrupted party is, and then the honest parties revealed their inputs to each other, and this is how they lower the round complexity of the protocol. But okay, so this is one example of such a weird protocol. Let's say that we don't want these types of protocol. They don't reveal to each other their inputs. Well, I claim that there is still a problem here, because one of the main tools that is being used in many of cryptographic protocols is something called secret sharing of the inputs. So what does this mean? It means that, let's say that party P1, this party wants to share its input, it's X1. What does it mean? It means that it sends some information to some string to the second party, to P2, and to the third party. And that string alone reveals nothing about X1, but together they somehow can reconstruct X1. So again, this is could lead to problems, because now the adversary holding one share of X1, it reveals nothing to him. But when it sends it to the other party knows X1. And this leads to the same results as before. So again, these are types of protocol that we don't wish to have. These are arguably undesirable. So this raises a natural question. Is there a way to extend this classical security notion that is being used so far to also prevent leakage of private information of honest parties to other honest parties? And maybe even a colluding subset of honest parties. So no three honest parties could learn more than they should learn. So this is the main question of this paper, and this is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk. So let's start with a naive solution. Why not simply increase the security threshold? So this means that, let's say we want security against 5 corruptions, just take a protocol secure against 6 corruptions. It seems intuitive. If we have, if the protocol is secure against more corrupted party, it should include the security that we desire for, where no honest party will learn more than they should, because the adversary is stronger. But I claim that there are still issues with this solution. So first of all, a very immediate problem with this is that it would be less efficient. We need to deal with more corruption. It will be harder to deal with. So we lose efficiency. But this also might be actually impossible, because when we increase security, the threshold security, when we want to deal with more corrupted parties, sometimes there are security guarantees that cannot happen if we want to deal with if there are too many corrupted parties. Specifically, if half of the parties are corrupted, then we know that fairness, for example, if one party learns the output, everyone does, it cannot be achieved. And indeed, we show in this paper that we gave an example of a three-party task that can be computed assuming one of the parties is malicious and one is what we call semi-honest. Semi-honest is a party that just follows the protocol but want to learn more information. And this functionality can be computed in the setting that we want, one malicious and one semi-honest, but it cannot be computed against two malicious. So if we simply increase the security threshold to dealing with two malicious parties, it suddenly becomes impossible. And lastly, if we look more carefully at how we actually define security, it turns out that in general, this doesn't work. So what do I mean doesn't work? It means that it might be the case that if we increase the security threshold, the protocol might be secure. But then if we take one of the malicious party and turn it into this semi-honest party that it does not collude with the adversary, it only try to infer information on its own, then suddenly, by weakening the adversary, this somehow compromise security. And although some protocol, in fact, most protocol that we know don't have this issue, we can turn malicious party into semi-honest and they will still be considered secure. We can construct protocols where this doesn't hold. So simply turning a malicious party into semi-honest party could somehow compromise security. And intuitively, the main reason that this can happen, so I will go into more details in 2 slides, but the main reason is that even though in the malicious setting, the adversary is stronger, to define security, we also need to construct something called a simulator. So it's another algorithm. And the strength of the simulator corresponds to the strength of the adversary. So if the adversary is strong, then the simulator is strong. And now if we turn a malicious party into a semi-honest party, it means that we weaken the adversary, and so we weaken the simulator. And there's no way to compare pairs of parties, pair of adversary and the simulator to another pair of adversary and simulator. We'll go into more details later. But to first understand it, I first need to show how we define security. So before going into that, are there any questions? Okay. So let me show you how we define security. I'll start with one possible way to try and do it, the first naive way. So let's say that we have a protocol here on the left. Well, one thing that we might try to do is to simply make a list of all the security properties that we want. We want correctness, for example, meaning that if the parties act honestly, then they will obtain the correct output. We might say that we want privacy. The parties don't learn more about more than what their input and the output should reveal to them. We might say that we want fairness. If one party learns the output, everyone does. And so on. We make this list. And when we try to prove security, we go over the list one by one and prove security. But there is a problem here. First of all, this is a very long list. This would lead to very long papers. Today we have very annoying page limits, so we want to avoid that. And second, it turns out that these properties are actually interweaved. So there is no actual good way to decouple them from each other. So a good security definition would somehow need to incorporate all of them together to capture everything at once. And this is what the second approach can do. And in the second approach, the way we define security is using a thought experiment. So how do we do it? So we imagine to ourselves the best case scenario that could ever happen to these 3 parties. So what's the best thing that can happen? And the best thing that can happen is to have someone that they trust in that will do the task for them. So they will simply send to this trusted party, this uncorruptible party. They will send it their inputs. This party will compute the output and then distribute it. Clearly, this is the best thing that can happen. But also, it's very clear that this party doesn't actually exist. This is not a real execution. This is something ideal that happens in our heads. But it turns out that we can use this to actually define security. And how we do it? The way we try to do it, to formulate it, is to say that what we want to have is that the real world protocol emulates this idealized execution. This should hold even if there are adversaries present in the real protocol. So for example, let's say that we have an adversary corrupting 2 and does whatever it wants to in the protocol. How do we say that the protocol is secure against that adversary? Our goal is to translate what the adversary does in the real protocol to what it does in the ideal protocol, in the ideal execution. And this would mean that it cannot do more harm in the real protocol than what it can do in this best case scenario, in this ideal world. What we'll translate this adversary into what we call a simulator. So this is an adversary participating in the ideal world, corrupting P2, which aims to simulate whatever the adversary in the real world did. And they act with the trusted party in the way we specified earlier. They will send every party will send an input to the trusted party. And notice that here we need to give the simulator his freedom to change the input. And the reason we must give it this freedom is because the real world adversary can also change its input. Nothing prevents it and no one will catch it. So they send inputs. Based on that, the trusted party computes the output and then it distributes it. And now, given this information, the simulator should output something called a view. This view is whatever the adversary in the real world saw. So it aims to simulate that. This includes all the messages that he see, all the prior information that he had, the randomness the coins that he tossed, and so on. So this should include everything that he sees. And if he can simulate it, and no one can distinguish the view in the real world from the view generated in the ideal world, then they're basically the same in our minds. And that's what the security definition says. And one last subtle thing is that we also want to include the output of the honest parties in this comparison. So at the end, we take the view and the view of the malicious parties and the output of the honest parties and compare the real and their ideal world counterparts. And if they look the same, then there is no difference. Right? And the reason why we include also the outputs of the honest parties is also to capture how much the adversary affected the output and how much he learns about the output. This is a subtle issue that we need to take care of. And this is the way we define security. This is called the real versus ideal paradigm. And notice that it's called a paradigm and not just a definition, because the only thing that we need to specify in order to have a security definition is the ideal world. Once we have some ideal world, the other parts of the definitions are already fixed. For any adversary, there exists a simulator such that something holds. So just to give you an example, let me define you something called security with a bot. This is also a very important security definition, because the previous definition that I showed you, which called full security, we cannot hope to achieve it all the time. So there's something called security with a bot that weakens the security guarantees, but we know how to achieve it for any adversary. So what does security with a bot mean? So we only need to specify the ideal world. So it starts the same. The party sends inputs and the trusted party computes the output up here. But now, instead of distributing the output to everyone, he will just send the output to the adversary. And now, based on this information, given the output, the adversary will tell the trusted party to either continue and send the output to all the honest parties or abort and tell them nothing. And now, based on whatever the adversary told it, the trusted party will either send the output to everyone or send a special symbol bot indicating that the execution aborted. And that's security for both. Once we have this, again, just like before, the simulator outputs a view. And now, just like before, we want to say that it's indistinguishable from the real execution. And if that's the case, then the protocol is considered secure with a both. So we can now use this paradigm, this real versus ideal paradigm, in order to introduce this new security notion. I mean, all we want to do is to somehow extend what I just defined. We still want the protocol to be secure against malicious attackers. We just want to add something to it. So we somehow need to redefine the ideal world so that it will capture what we want. So just very, very roughly how it goes. So the way we define the security notion, which we call security with friends and foes, because it should the security should hold against friends and foes alike, the foes being the malicious adversary and the friends being the honest parties, or in short, FAF security. So in essence, what we want to say is that in addition to saying that every adversary is simulatable, meaning there exists a simulator in the ideal world that I just specified, any party, any semi-honest party, can also be simulated in some way. We can also simulate his view in that ideal execution. And we also want it to hold, even if the adversary sends it some non-prescribed messages. For example, like the shares, the example of the shares that I gave at the beginning of the talk. This is something that was not specified by the protocol, but the adversary can do whatever it wants to do. So even with that, we still want to be able to somehow simulate the view of honest party. And this should hold for any honest party. So if we switch the roles of which one we want to simulate, then again, we still want it to be simulatable with respect to the same adversary. So we fix an adversary, and then for every honest party, there exists another simulator. And this is a very, very rough way of how we define it. And before formally giving you the definition, I want to first show you some of our results about FAF security. So we provide three main results. So the first thing that we showed is a characterization. So this characterization means that under standard cryptographic assumption, which I don't want to go into them, what they mean in this talk, but just know that they are standards. We know that any functionality can be computed with TH star FAF security, where T indicates the number of malicious party and H star indicates the number of those semi-honest party that act honestly. Then security against those adversary holds if and only if this equation holds. So this means that if 2T plus H star is smaller than the number of parties, then anything can be computed. And if it doesn't hold, then there exists some task that cannot be computed securely. So this is the first theorem that we proved. The second theorem that we showed considered the round complexity. So again, under standard cryptographic assumption, we show that any functionality can be computed with 1-1 FAF security in just 3 rounds. So 1-1 FAF security means one malicious party and one semi-honest party, like in all of the examples I showed earlier. And in fact, this positive result can also be extended to the case where there are more malicious party and more semi-honest party, but I don't want to go into it. And we also give a complement result showing that in 2 rounds, there exists some function that cannot be computed. And this gives light to what I said at the very beginning of the talk about the result of Ishai Kushilevitz and Paskin Cherniavsky that utilizes the fact that honest party can reveal information to each other in the classical definition in order to reduce round complexity to 2 rounds. So this result showed that revealing that information was actually necessary in order to reduce the round complexity to being so low. And finally, we also give comparisons to other definitions. So in addition to showing, to comparing it to the classical definition, so a good one, so we compare it TH star FAF security to T plus H star security. So so you can think of it as taking the semi-honest party and the malicious party, and now they are being co-opted by one entity, one malicious adversary. So this is the T plus H star. we show that it doesn't necessarily imply TH star faf security, like I mentioned earlier. And in fact, we can even refine this result and showing that something called mixed security doesn't imply faf security. The mixed security means that is security against one adversarial entity that controls some of the parties maliciously and some of the parties semi-honestly. And if you compare it to faf security, in faf security, we can view it as two different entities, one malicious adversary and one semi-honest adversary, and they are not colluding with each other. And we show that we can show that there are protocols secure against mixed adversaries that are not secure in the faf setting. Okay, so before moving on to the formal definition of faf security, are there any questions? Okay, so if there are no more questions, let me define faf security. So if you recall, so before that, the definition will follow the real versus ideal paradigm, just like we did with the classical definition. So I'm going to describe you an ideal execution, and that will be enough to actually define security. And second thing that we will do is that it will be very convenient to view those honest parties that aims to learn some more information as being corrupted by some adversary. So now we'll have two entities, a malicious adversary and a semi-honest adversary. And it's important to know that this semi-honest adversary is not colluding with the original malicious adversary that can do whatever it wants. And moreover, we want to have the semi-honest party to have an output just like the honest party. So if you recall, in the ideal world that I described previously, honest party had an output, and it was necessary to protect them from the malicious adversary. So in our definition of faf security, we view the semi-honest party basically just like honest party, because today they are being honest, and tomorrow they might get corrupted. So we want to protect them from the adversary in this current execution. So giving them an output is necessary. And finally, I just want to stress it that in the real world, the malicious adversary can send whatever it wants to the semi-honest adversary. It doesn't have to be anything specified by the protocol. And in fact, it can even happen after the protocol is already terminated. Days after it, we don't care. So these are just a few notes to keep in mind. So based on these, we are going to give a security definition. We construct an ideal world that captures all of this. So how is it done? So I'll start with full security, which was the first, corresponds to the first ideal world that I described. So we have three parties. Let's say that the first party here is malicious, the second one is semi-honest, and the third one is the fully honest. Each of them has an input. And now in addition, we'll have the adversary. Now I want to specify that he has a randomness. He also had randomness in the original definition, but now it will be important to actually stress it. He has some randomness and some prior information, which we call auxiliary information. I don't want to go into why it's important, but it's important for something called the composability of the definition. This is just the auxiliary information, is just prior knowledge that he has. So how does the execution in the ideal world happen? So it starts the same. Every party sends an input to the trusted party, with the malicious party changing its input, but the semi-honest party keeps it to its original input. It acts honestly, so it doesn't change its input. Then, based on that, the trusted party computes an output. In general, it doesn't have to be the same output for everyone. It could be a different output for different parties. So based on that, he distributes the correct outputs to each of the parties. So the first output to the first party, the second output to the second party, and so on. So up until now, nothing changed from the original definition. The ideal world, we did not modify it yet. But now comes the important change. What we do is we let the malicious adversary send its entire ideal world view to the semi-honest party. And this includes its original input, its auxiliary information, the prior information that he had, its randomness, and the output that he received from the trusted party, which might be different from the output that the second party received. So it sends it everything that he has. And now, based on that information, the parties will output the corresponding view. The simulator will output the corresponding view, with the semi-honest simulator also outputting whatever it received from the trusted party. If you recall, this is necessary to protect it from the malicious adversary. And finally, the honest party simply outputs whatever it received from the trusted party. So why did we actually force the malicious adversary to send its entire real world view to the semi-honest party? Is because, as I said earlier, you can send in the real world whatever it wants to. So in the protocol, you can send for all we care its entire view. So to compensate for that in the ideal world, we must allow the adversary to send its entire ideal world view to the semi-honest party. So this is just to compensate that fact. So now, given this, we basically have a security definition. But notice that, in fact, we have two flavors of security, not just one, like in the classical definition. Because the first thing that we can ask for is, in terms of security, what we call weak fast security, is to ask for the two things to hold. So the first equation that we want to hold is basically the same as what we had in the classical definition. The view of the malicious parties and the output of the honest parties in the real world is indistinguishable from their ideal world counterpart. And on top of that, now we add this second requirement, saying that the view of the semi-honest parties and the output of the honest parties is indistinguishable from their ideal world counterparts. So this is just one way to define security. But we can ask for something stronger. We can ask for requiring all of those three random variables to be indistinguishable from the ideal world counterparts. And notice that this is a stronger definition because here we also need to, the simulator also need to simulate the correlation between the two views, whereas in the weak definition, they don't need to do it. So, okay, so before moving on, are there any questions about the definition? Okay. So I defined two flavors of security, a weaker security and a stronger security, but it's a natural question to ask whether the weak security is actually weaker. So now I'm going to show you a simple example as to why it's not necessarily that weak security implies strong security. So weak security is actually weaker in general. So this is going to be a very dumb protocol, actually. The functionality that we're going to consider is what's called a secure channel. So the first party will hold some input, and only the second party should learn this input. The third party learns nothing. It starts with nothing and it ends with nothing. And here is a very dumb protocol to do it. I mean, a very good protocol to do it will just be forcing P1 to send its input to P2. That's a good protocol. But now I'm going to show you a different protocol for doing this. So for this, the parties are going to use something called a commitment scheme. So you can think of a commitment scheme, or you can think of this as like a digital safe. So P1 holds, puts its input X in some safe called C. And now, given this safe, no one knows what's written in there. But so this is the first part of the commitment scheme. It hides whatever written inside. But there's also a key to opening this commitment. So it can also decommit to it. So if it later sends the key, it cannot lie about what's written inside. If it committed to 0, it cannot later say, well, no, I committed to 1. It cannot lie about it. So the protocol is going to be the following. After he computed this commitment C, he will send it to both of the parties. He will broadcast it. And to the correct party, to the second party, he will also send the original input X. And then this party will simply output X. So we just send the commitment scheme for no reason. That's the protocol. I claim that this protocol is a weak FAF secure, but not strong FAF secure. So I'm going to consider only one case for the proof, where the case is that the third party that should learn nothing is malicious, and the second party is semi-honest. So the second party is the one that learns X. So why is it weak FAF secure against these two adversaries? So we want to construct simulators. So notice that the malicious adversary, all that he sees is just a safe. He got C. C tells him nothing. So he could just, the simulator could just put 0 in the safe and there's no difference. The semi-honest simulator cannot put 0 in the safe because he knows X. He must know X. This is part of the information that it receives. But the semi-honest simulator receives X from the trusted party. So he has it, so he can commit to X. So this is the view of the semi-honest party. But notice that for strong security, strong security requires that both of these commitments to be the same, because in the real world, the adversary holds a commitment of X, and the semi-honest party also holds a commitment of X. It's a commitment of the same value, and this value is known to one of them. So this cannot happen in the ideal world because the simulator of the adversary knows nothing about X. And because he knows nothing about X, he cannot perform the commitment correctly. So this proves that there is no strong security. Okay, so before moving to the results, I'm going to show you the results. I showed you earlier the results. I'm going to talk about them again. Before that, I also want to define FAF security with abort. So if you remember, in the classical definition, security with abort was a way to disregard fairness. So it reveals the output to the adversary, and then the adversary decided whether it wants to or not to reveal the output to the other parties. So how we define it in FAF terms? So it starts the same. Let's say we have three parties, malicious, semi-honest, and honest. They send inputs with only the malicious party changing it, and the trusted party computes the correct output. And in the original definition, it sends the output only to the malicious adversary. But here in the FAF version, what we want to is to also have the trusted party send the output to the semi-honest simulator. And the reason we allow it is because even though in the real world protocol, the adversary might cause the parties to abort, this is what security with abort means. We allow him to cause an abort. It doesn't mean that the parties don't learn the output. So we want to compensate for the fact that he might learn something about the output. So the simulator must receive this information from the trusted party. And now, just like before, the malicious adversary sends its entire ideal world view to the semi-honest party. And now, he will tell the trusted party whether to continue or abort. And this, based on this continue or abort, this trusted party will tell the semi-honest simulator either continue or abort, and to the honest party, it will reveal the output or not. Now, based on that, the malicious adversary outputs some view. The semi-honest party will output some view, and maybe it will output the output that it received from the trusted party, and maybe not. It depends on whether the adversary sent continue or abort. And the fully honest party will output whatever it received from the trusted party. And from here, the security is defined the same as the previous case. We have weak security and we have strong security. Okay, so let me give you a recap of our results. So we gave a characterization, we talked about run complexity, and we also gave comparison to other security definitions, to classical security definitions. So with the time I have left, I want to talk about the characterization. What I'm going to show you is that under standard assumptions, any M-party functionality can be computed with TH star of security if and only if 2T plus H star is strictly smaller than the number of parties. Okay, so let me start with the positive direction. So we assume that the 2T plus H star is strictly smaller than the number of parties, and we aim to construct a protocol for an arbitrary function. So the idea here was going to be something called the player elimination technique. So how does it work? So first of all, we showed that a protocol called GMW. So it's a classical protocol. I don't want to go into how it works, but it turns out that it admits something called FAF security with identifiable abort. So security of identifiable abort is exactly the same as security with abort, with the addition that if the malicious adversary caused an abort, he tells the trusted party to send abort to the other parties, then he actually must reveal the identity of the corrupted party. In other words, if the honest parties knows that there was an attack, then they know the identity of one of the attackers. So player elimination techniques utilizes this fact, and what we will do is we'll have the parties try to compute the function with security with identifiable abort. If it worked, it worked. They have the output. If not, they know someone is corrupted. They know its identity, so they can just throw him away from the computation and restart the execution. So this is very roughly how the player elimination technique goes. So a bit more formally, the parties will not directly compute the function, but they will compute something called an M minus T out of M secret sharing of the output. So think for now that the output is just, so there's a common output for everyone. So what is an M minus T out of M secret sharing of it means? It means that everyone receive a share of the output. It's called a share of the output. But the requirement is that at least M minus T of the parties need to join forces in order to actually reconstruct the output. So if we have less than M minus T parties, their complete view, take the view of any less than M minus T parties, it reveals nothing to it. It's completely random. But the view of any M minus T parties, you can take it and reconstruct from it the original output of the function. So now, after they try to compute, they try to do it with security with identifiable abort. So there might be an abort that happens during this computation. But as I said before, if there is an abort, they know the identity of one malicious party, so they will simply throw them away and restart. Otherwise, they have enough information to reconstruct the output. So they just send their shares to each other and reconstruct the output of the function. And that's it. That's the entire protocol. So why should it be secure? So the main reason is that if you take the joint view of the malicious and the semi-honest parties, so there are at most T plus H star such parties, by assumption, this is strictly less than the number of shares required to actually learn anything from the output of GMW. So this is the reason they're using M minus T shares, because the number of malicious party and semi-honest parties is strictly less than that. So they learn nothing. That's it. That's the entire proof of security. So just a couple of notes. So if you look carefully at this construction, this is actually a reduction to security of identifiable abort, because we don't actually care if the parties use GMW or not. And this reduction is actually strong FAF security. However, the entire protocol achieves only weak FAF security because of GMW. And the reason why GMW is only weak FAF security is because it uses commitments. If you remember, I gave the example about why weak FAF security doesn't imply strong FAF security. The main reason was the commitments. And in fact, interestingly enough, the same protocol actually can admit FAF security for even higher thresholds for various interesting functionalities. So for example, if we take coin tossing, so coin tossing means that all parties output the same bit. First of all, it's the same bit, and with probability half it will be 0, with probability half it will be 1. And they all agree on it. And it turns out that the protocol works assuming T is strictly less than half the number of parties, but the number of semi-honest could be arbitrary. There's no limit to it. Obviously, it needs to be less than n minus T. And another example, even with inputs, there is the XOR functionality. Free-party XOR functionality turns out to be secure against one malicious and one semi-honest. And these are very interesting examples because this comes back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that just increasing the security threshold might be impossible. And the reason why it might be impossible is these two examples. Free-party XOR and coin tossing are generally impossible if we simply increase the security threshold. But if we only care about increasing H star, then suddenly it's possible. And this is what this proof shows. Okay, so before going to the negative direction, are there any questions? Okay. So now I'm going to talk about the negative direction. Specifically, I'm going to consider only the free-party case with 1-1 fast security. This is a special case. It turns out that we can take this special case and use it to prove the more general case. I'm not going to get into the details, but it's a standard technique. So for now, just the free-party case. So let me start with a very rough intuition of how the proof goes. So we have 3 parties, and let's put on the left the timeline of the rounds. So at round 0, before the parties start to interact, no one knows anything about the output. They haven't exchanged any information, so no one knows anything. Well, now they start interacting. So the first party now sends a message to the second party and to the third party. Now, after that, the second party sends its messages to the other 2 parties, and then the third party sends its messages, and so on. This happens one by one. And if the protocol has R rounds, then after R rounds, everyone knows anything. So they started with no one knowing anything to everyone knowing anything in just R rounds. So now let's take a look at at a single round. What happens in that round? So intuitively, this party, if it sends messages to the other pair of parties, then it reveals to them some information about the output. And if that happens in our rounds, so this pair of parties actually gains some advantage in knowing the output compared to any of the other pairs, because these 2 gained more information than, say, these 2, because this party didn't send any message yet. It didn't send its next message. And because this happens in a few rounds, in our rounds, this means that somewhere in the middle, there should be a jump in the knowledge. So this pair, suddenly they know a lot, just because the other third party send them some information. There has to be a round where this is considered a lot of information, because in our round, they're going from knowing nothing to knowing everything. So the idea is to utilize this fact, which I didn't mention, by the way. It's the first one to use this idea was due to Cliff in '86. We're building on top of the same idea. The way we're trying to utilize this jump is by having an adversary corrupting one of the parties in the pair. And now, in the next round, when he's supposed to send a message, instead of actually sending it, he will do nothing. He will not send the original message. He will abort. He will tell the other parties, hey, I'm malicious, I'm not sending you anything. So now the other parties must interact in some way to reconstruct the output. But if you remember, when I said that there was a jump, this jump was only with respect to this pair. Specifically, this pair of parties know more about the output than this pair. So when they try to interact and reconstruct the output, the output that they will have will be it will have less information about the real output than whatever this can reconstruct. So after they finished interacting and computing the output, the protocol had already ended. But now the malicious adversary will send its entire ideal world view to the other party from its pair. And now this other party realizes that he has more information about the output, because now he gained the entire information of this pair. He knows everything that there was in this jump. And this is the very rough idea of how we can actually prove that the protocol is insecure. But so this is a very rough idea. Now the only thing that is left to do in order to actually formally prove it is to give an example, because if you remember, I already mentioned that, for example, XOR can be computed in this setting because I gave a protocol, and coin tossing can also be computed in this setting, the same protocol from before. So we need to construct a functionality, a very specific function, very carefully, so that that protocol will not, so that this attack will actually work. Because sometimes this jump, when it occurs, it's actually fine. It's not always a bad thing that cannot be simulated. Okay, so what's the idea behind the construction of the function? So let's give names to this party, A, B, and C. So consider the following function. So this function is defined as follows. So the first and the third party, each of them will hold sufficiently long strings, or bit strings. And the second party, you can think of this YA and YC as sort of authentication of the strings A and C. What do I mean by authentication? So forget about this WOP for a minute. If this authentication, if A is authenticated, the authentication of A is YA, and the authentication of C is YC, then everyone will learn A and C. Otherwise, if one of the authentication fails, then no one learns anything aside from their inputs. So what is this authentication? What is this WOP? This WOP means a one-way permutation. A one-way permutation is a function that, first of all, it's very easy to compute in one way. So given A, it's easy to compute YA. So verifying this can be done efficiently. But doing the other way around is very hard. So if you give me only YA, I won't be able to reconstruct A. So this means that B holding YA and YC doesn't know A and C. And finally, this is a permutation. So it means that not only does so generally when we say one way, it means that an adversary given YA will not be able to find any pre-image of it. So it will not be able to find any A that satisfies this. But when I say permutation, this A is unique, so you cannot even find, so there's only one such A and you cannot find it. So this is one-way permutation. So what happens in the ideal world? So intuitively, the reason why we use this sort of authentication is because let's suppose that A is being malicious, is the corrupted one. So the simulator corrupts A, and now it needs to change its input, because that's the only way that it can interact with the trusted party. But if it changes its inputs, because this is a permutation, this will no longer be YA. So this equation will not hold. So everyone will receive both, including B. But now if B is semi-honest, then it doesn't have the information that is necessary for him to recover C. Because if you remember, this is one way. Given YC, he cannot reconstruct C. So he cannot recover C. And this only holds if A changes its input. And if it does not change its input, then B can recover C. But if B recovers C, then everyone recovers C. And this is in contrast to what I already showed you in the real world. In the real world, I showed you that in any ARM protocol, there exists some round I with a jump. Specifically, we can show that there is a jump between the knowledge that the information that A and B holds and the information that B and C holds. So either A and B learns more than B and C, or B and C learn more than A and B. In other words, it means that. So no, okay. So I'll explain it. It would be convenient to explain it later. Okay, so this is in contrast to the ideal world. So now when we compare the two, we can see that there is a problem here. Okay, so what's the problem? Why can't we actually simulate them? So let's put the function on top, and without loss of generality, let's assume that A and B gain more information about the output than B and C. So why is this a problem? So our malicious attacker would be exactly as before. It will corrupt A. It will act honestly until this special round I, where there was a jump. It will abort and not sending any messages to anyone. And then after B and C finish their interaction and outputting what the protocol specified them to output, the attacker A will send its entire view to B. And that's it, that's the entire attack. So now let us compare the real and ideal world. So so we'll denote by P the probability that B and C are able to recover the output. So what happens in the real world? By definition, the third party, the honest party, will be able to recover the output with probability that is equal to P. Because the ideal world must be indistinguishable from the real world, it means that A must send its original input, again, with probability that is roughly P. Because if it does not do it, it doesn't do it, it changes its input, then as I said before, this equation up top doesn't hold. So the trusted party will see the authentication fails, so he sends bot to everyone, including C. So C will output bot in that case. So A must keep its input with probability that is roughly P. But if he sends its input with probability roughly P, then that means that B can recover the output with probability that is only roughly P, because the only way for B to recover the output C is if A sends its input. That's why we use this one-way permutation. But as I said before, the probability that B can recover C in the real world is not this equation on the right, is not this P, it's this P plus roughly 1 over R, because he has the entire view of A. He can do this, he can recover A and C using whatever A saw in that interaction. So now we have a difference of roughly 1 over R between the real and the ideal world. And that concludes the proof. So this was only for 3 parties. Like I said before, we can use this results on 3 parties to extend it to more parties using something called the player partitioning argument. I will not go into it, but it's a common technique. In fact, we can this argument even rules out something called fair computation. Fairness means that if one party learns the output, everyone learns the output. And the main reason for that is because aborting and changing the input is exactly the same for the function that we considered. Again, I don't want to go into too much details here. But finally, something very interesting about this attack is that it's actually independent of the adversary's view. Because if you recall, the only thing that the adversary does is waiting for a special round. It could be random round, it doesn't know. He just wait for it, aborts and send its view. That's it. He doesn't care what his view tells, what his view says. It's completely independent of it. We can even construct protocols where the view of that single party is actually random throughout the entire execution. So the view will tell him nothing either way. And this means that this attack is actually applicable even if we assume the parties use simultaneous broadcast. So if you remember, I said that one party sends a message, and the second party sends a message, and the third party sends a message. In simultaneous broadcast, everyone sends a message together and receives the messages together. So because the adversary's view, the attack is independent of the adversary's view, it doesn't care about it. It doesn't need to rush anything. It doesn't need to wait for information to be sent to him in order to perform the attack. And that's it. So let me summarize the talk. So we introduced a new security notion, which we call security with friends and foes, or FAF security, which aims to protect the honest parties, not from just malicious parties, but from other honest parties. We believe it to be interesting from both theoretical and practical perspective. And we also proved some various results about this security notion, which include the characterization, round complexity we investigated, and we also gave comparison to various other more classical definitions. And that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Bar.
Thank you.
So probably someone has a question. Oh, Bar, can I ask then? It's not connected with your talk, actually, but it's about the same beginning, about the issue considered as an, as an example about the voting.
Yes.
What do you think about the modern voting protocols?
No, we haven't taken a look at how voting protocols work today. We only use it as a motivation.
Okay.
There are other motivations, for example, like credit card information. If we use that as inputs, I don't want to reveal my credit card information to you, because even though we know each other, I know that you're honest, still private information.
Thank you. So the next
voting is an important problem, and it's far from being
yes
solved. I think the main problems are what you might call side channels attack, because it's somewhat harder to make sure that people have a free vote when they use digital systems, and also when you choose to go for a digital system, then you need to trust the supplier of the provider of the system. So
yes.
This is also a problem. And
but this is the problem outside the cryptography itself, right?
Yes, yeah. There has been in Israel, there has been like an experiment. I don't know. It's actually a true it was a true election for one of the parties in Israel that was made in via a digital system at the center of Herzliya. What's the IDC? At IDC, they came up with a full voting system, and the Meretz party used it for their inner elections.
The primaries.
So for in terms of cryptography, there are systems, but the problem is a more holistic one. Anyways, guys, I need to go. Thanks a lot. I have a request. People who are still here, okay, the people who are here did not come in late, but trying to not come in late. And Olga, we should make sure that that the link is sent out to everyone beforehand. Bar, thanks a lot for the talk. I learned a lot. I did.
תודה רבה בר, באמת. גם אני נהניתי.
יופי.
I hope next week we are going to listen Vitaly Dminuk about networking, and the next talk in the beginning of May is freestyle. So if someone wants to give a talk, please just write to me or to Evelyn. Thank you, Bar.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Alex, for listening.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.